Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Meepleville Meets. Today, we are talking to a designer who had the number one game on Board Game Geek for quite a long time, and we're very excited to have him here today. So please welcome to the show, Jason Mathews. Hello, Jason.
Hey, Tim. Thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Oh, yes, and I appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for joining us. So, first of all, I just want to ask, how does it feel to have the number one game on Board Game Geek, which we can almost say is the number one game in the world, at least for gamers like us? I mean, that's got to feel great, right? Or when you did have it for that long stretch of period.
Yeah, I mean, it was weird because that Ananda and I did not design the game trying to crack the number one slot for Board Game Geek, and it was weirdly sort of bittersweet to see your own game start climbing over things that you really like, games I love, because long before I was a designer, I was just a fanboy game nerd like everybody else. So that was kind of both a proud and weird sensation to see your favorite games, your own game climb over your favorites. But yeah, it was awesome. It has kind of distorted my experience as a designer in the sense that I don't really, I don't have to introduce who I am or what my designs are when I go to approach companies. They know already, so that's a nice thing.
But you've also put yourself in a weird position too, because you have an extremely high bar to meet, right? In a sense,
almost impossibly high bar to meet.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's got to be tough for any of your designs moving forward, because
right.
That just hit the peak so much up there. So yeah, I'd like to get into, we'll talk about Twilight Struggle a little bit later and stuff. But first of all, I'd like to get to know a little bit more about you. So you're on the East Coast, I believe, correct?
I am actually from Los Angeles, but I've been here I've been in DC, or the greater DC area, for a long time.
Okay, and since the majority of your games, if not all of them, deal with like history, politics, things like that, and you're in the DC area, what is your background? I don't know if you been to college or anything like that, but how did you sort of get steered towards this realm of history and politics?
Well, I mean, I came out to DC to work in government. I spent 13 years as a Senate staffer, and I'm a lobbyist now. So to a certain extent, the games I work on are also the sort of things that I deal with as an occupation. But I developed a love for history because of my grandfather used to sit me on his knee and read histories about World War II and whatever. And so since that experience was so formative, I've always grown up with this deep appreciation for history. He had wanted me to be an author, to write, historical novels and whatnot. I never got around to that. So I suppose designing board games kind of scratches that itch a little.
Oh, okay. Uh-oh. So there's coming through. Just want to make sure that's not coming through. Okay. So one of the things that I want to you talked about lobbying. So sort of like as a sidetrack real quick, for many people like me, we hear that term a lot, right? Lobbyist, this and that, and people have strong opinions on either side about lobbyists, right? So if you could, can you briefly educate me and the audience as exactly what you do or what a lobbyist does? What is their primary job or primary goal?
Well, there are different kinds, and at this stage, I've experienced all of them to a greater or lesser extent. When I first left the Hill, I was the token Democrat, one of the two token Democrats at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I went from there over to BP, the oil company. I spent some time in a nonprofit organization working against child trafficking. And then most recently, I'm with a lobbying firm with a variety of clients. Almost everybody who is a lobbyist spent considerable time in government or notable time in government. And what we are basically paid to do is to help people navigate the way the Congress or administrative agencies work, because it's a cloud, and it's very much similar to the practice of law in the sense that you wouldn't walk into a courtroom not understanding any of its process or procedures or the personalities involved. That's why you hire a lawyer. You do the same thing when you are dealing with the Congress. They're both courtrooms and the Congress are democratic entities. They're open to the public, but that doesn't mean that you are best served by walking in without any expertise. And everybody who kind of does this work has developed an expertise in congressional procedure and legislative process, legislative drafting, and all of these other things that you need in order to accomplish legislative goals in the Congress, or regulatory goals with the administration. It's people think that lobbyists sort of carry bags of money over to members of Congress, and they buy votes and all of this nonsense, and that's kind of the Hollywood depiction of things. But there are caps on how much money that anybody can give a member of Congress, lobbyist or otherwise. I don't know a member of Congress who would sell their vote for the small amount of money that we're actually able to contribute.
Yes. So,
I'm not saying I don't know any members who would sell their vote, just not for how much we can contribute.
Oh, there you go. So, since you've done games like the Founding Fathers and the campaign right of 2008, and the Making of the President and stuff like that, and you work in politics in Washington, you're within inside of it. How much is accurate? I mean, I know it is, I'm sure, with your games and stuff, but how much creative license, I guess my question is, within your games as opposed to real life?
So I have always taken the point of view that if you had to make a call between accuracy and simulative value and fun, always go with fun. So if you make a compromise, lean in that direction and lean somewhat less towards accuracy. But I'm also proud of the fact that I get a lot of emails from teachers who use our games in their classrooms and as an exercise, because I do think we have tried to inject as much history and as much actual governmental process into those games as possible. So it makes learning some of that effortless, as opposed to, the rote or textbook process that you would experience ordinarily in school.
Yes, and I would agree with that 100%, because Twilight Struggle is truly an education, but it is a fantastic game because it's actual real history and stuff. So that's one of the questions I have here. So in designing the game, was your number one goal, because you sort of just alluded to it about how you'd rather default to fun if one comes up against the other, but still, was sort of your main intention to educate?
It wasn't actually. We had a variety of objectives when we designed that game, and education really wasn't on the list. That was something that follows a little bit naturally for the kind of game we were designing at the time. But the main things on Ananda and I's agenda when we were designing that, both of us had been playing card-driven games ever since the first one came out, which was Mark Herman's We the People. And that game's about the American Revolutionary War. It takes about 2 hours to play. And both of us were like, this is genius. You get this very satisfying, full, epic experience in an amount of time that is kind of fits our lifestyle now that we've got jobs and families and responsibilities. We don't have 13 hours to play a war game anymore. But after We the People, almost every other game that was coming out was getting longer and longer rather than keeping to those original parameters. So our primary objective when we designed Twilight Struggle was to push game design back in that direction, to make it more accessible and a little more sort of family friendly, in the sense that we wanted the hobby to be compatible with our lives.
So you brought up your co-designer, Ananda Gupta, and tell us a little bit about how you two met and how that relationship started and how it came about that you guys were like, okay, let's design a game together.
So the funny thing about Ananda and I is that we both grew up in Los Angeles. We both went to the same hobby store in LA and, well, Pasadena, and we didn't know each other, but we met here in DC. He was also a policy wonk. He was working for a think tank, and I was working in the Senate at the time. We were part of the same game group, and as part of that group, we would pull off and play war games while a lot of our friends were playing whatever Euro was new and raging. Ananda got very engaged with GMT on Consim World and those sort of things, and so he started playtesting, and I was his playtest opponent. And we saw some great things. We playtested Wilderness War for Volko Ruhnke and some other games, but some of the designs we started seeing, we realized we think we could actually do this better, and that's what prompted us to design Twilight Struggle.
Okay, to a relationship, co-designing a game, there has to be give and take, push and pull for ideas to get to the final thing. So was it truly, through the whole process, a collaborative effort, 50-50? Did one do more than the other for certain reasons or not? Or how did that process play out?
I think everybody I have done several collaborations now, and people bring different strengths to any collaborative venture, and people are varyingly busy with their actual professions. So I don't think any of these have been 50-50, and in some instances I was pulling the weight, and in other instances I was the one who was being pulled. And I think that's all fine. The situation with Ananda and I is that we always agree on the design and then quibble over details. With Christian Leonard, who I have worked with a number of times and who is a very good friend of mine, we always quibble about the design and agree on the details. So it's a entirely different working experience.
Oh, okay. So then what were, say, Jason Mathews' strengths that were brought to Twilight Struggle in particular? What were the things that sort of the game would not exist without your input, per se?
Well, I think one advantage that I have over Ananda is that I'm a little older than he is. And so I was able to, I literally prattled off our first card list, and we actually shrank it down to the card set it is now. But having experienced a bunch of the Cold War and having studied international relations during the 80s, which was essentially studying the Cold War, I could, by rote, basically go from the beginning of the Cold War until that time and identify the major events without really giving it much of a second thought. After we had the list, we started paring down to meet the criteria that we wanted for the game.
Now, in the development of Twilight Struggle, that's another very interesting thing, because I actually love Twilight Struggle. It's been a while since I played it, because it's one of those kind of things where you have to make sure you have the right partner playing that game, because it is a time investment. You both have to like the history and all that kind of stuff. So it's you just have to make sure that combination is right. Right. But if I remember correctly, there are the three sort of eras, right, with the deck of cards.
Indeed.
Now, how hard was your play testing? Because again, I've talked to several designers, and sort of the overlying statement is you're never going to find everything, right? Because once you put it in production, it gets to Board Game Geek, say, for example, or gets out to the public. Now you're going to have literally thousands, if not millions of people playing your game. So they're going to find something or catch something that you may have missed. So how much play testing went into Twilight Struggle?
So that really is an obscene problem with card-driven games, because if you're dealing with 200 cards, the infinite number of combinations and sequential order that cards might come out in, and who plays what at what time and in what turn, and all of these other things. You're absolutely right. You can't find everything. As a matter of fact, about 6 months ago, and keeping in mind it is 2020, the game came out in 2005, I saw yet another rules question, which was a case of first impression. Some card combination that no one had ever encountered before, and we had to clarify. And as you say, millions of games have been played, and we've been playing for 15 years, and I still got a rules question that I was like, well, I better check with Ananda. I don't know what to do with this.
Wow. That's pretty incredible that happens. So in the particulars of the gameplay, and I remember you said about like 2 hours, you were looking to stay within that range. However, I've never been able to play a game of Twilight Struggle with 2 hours. I do know people who can, but they are hardcore Twilight Struggle. They know the cards, they know what's coming out. So you weren't really able to achieve that goal in essence, were you?
Yeah, I say 2 hours, and I say 2 hours with We the People. In both cases, I'm talking about people who are experienced players. The problem with all card-driven games is if you have to read the cards as opposed to already know the text, then you've just added a third more time to your card play. As a matter of fact, I just taught the game to my children for the first. They played some of my other games, but they'd never played Twilight Struggle. They played this last weekend, but that was what was the most time-consuming thing, where my daughter insisted on reading every single card before she would play a headline, and it was driving my son insane.
So now, with the title of Twilight Struggle and the actual historical period, the Cold War, and the dates, and since you're in Washington, you work in politics, you're right around it and stuff, is that period something we can sort of look back upon, or does it essentially still exist a little bit? I'm trying to, ask you like the history of the game itself, the Cold War period, and now how has that period progressed into today?
I think that's a very fair point. We talk about the Cold War ending essentially with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Tends to be the date that historians pick as the end of the Cold War. But it's clearly true that there's a continuity in the relationship between the United States and modern Russia, and the sources of conflict relate both to the Cold War and to how it ended. And those frictions very much inform the state of that relationship now. That said, I think it would be a mistake to look on modern day Russia as a peer and a competitor in the same way that the Soviet Union was, in the 70s and 80s.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, there is a big difference because, like you said, I'm that age too, right? I'm 57 years old, so I clearly remember growing up in that period. As a matter of fact, I was just talking to a friend about it the other day, how I think I was in maybe first or second grade, but we were still doing the drills where you had to get under your desk for.
Me too. I remember duck and cover very distinctly.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and then let's talk about another game, and especially whoops. Sorry about that. So what's going on today, right? Because we just went through an election about, I don't know, November 3rd, whatever it is, a month and a half ago, whatever the time period. And you have the campaign game. And so how do you feel, or because that's always been talk, right? About, let me see, I'm trying to word this question correctly, because with history in the Electoral College and how that comes about and plays in today, because a lot of those things, of course, were designed by the founding fathers, which is another one of your games there. So what is your thoughts in particular, or your personal feelings about things that were made back then by the founding fathers, which were fantastic, which are great, really ahead of their time, and in essence they've kind of held still to this day? However, some of those things do need to be changed and adjusted in a lot of people's opinions. What are your thoughts about things like that, especially as it pertains to, say, the Electoral College?
So I will say this at the outset. I don't believe that there is anything that ails American democracy, and we have a lot of problems. But I don't believe there's anything that ails American democracy that will be solved by a silver bullet solution. And reforming the Electoral College is certainly not one of those things that will help make all by itself, will not make our democracy healthy. That said, it would also be a mistake to think that just because the founders incorporated it into the Constitution in 1789, that it should be dealt with as sacrosanct and not subject to any change. We moved to the direct election of senators as opposed to allowing states to choose senators because that system stopped working. Most people don't really understand why we did this. There's a sense that we switched to direct election of senators because people were in a populist mood and we wanted more democracy. There was an element of that, but really what had happened was state legislatures, because most of them were bicameral, just like the Congress, state legislatures were increasingly controlled with one house in Democratic hands and the other house in Republican hands. And those states could not agree on a senator to send to Washington. And therefore, states would go for years without having a senator. And that problem is what necessitated the change in the Constitution. I think something similar is happening now with the Electoral College, as people in California are sort of like, why is my vote worth half as much as someone in Wyoming's? I think those are legitimate inquiries. And in addition, the original justification for the Electoral College, that it would stand as a little bit of a buttress between the electorate and bringing on someone who is unfit for office. I think a lot of people would argue that the Electoral College has not met that obligation and won't meet that obligation in the future. So that sort of undermines the reason for its existence. If it's not going to serve as a check, then what do we need it for? Now, that said, there is one thing we need it for. because we still have a gap between the election and when somebody becomes a president. And we nearly had a president die in that amount of time. He died a few weeks after he was inaugurated. But if a president were to die between November and when we inaugurate a president in January, if we don't have an electoral college to choose a president, we have no great method for resolving that problem.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Yeah, and also I understand through history, and I could be wrong, but the reason that there was that length of time from the election to the inauguration was because, 150, 200 years ago, like people didn't have planes and trains and communications and stuff. So
exactly.
It took months to move. So yeah, so things like that could change. But also, there's an interesting point you brought up about, say, the Senate and the representation, because when it comes to discussions about that, it seems it's always the California versus Wyoming.
Yeah,
those are the two that always come up. So with that being said, because I'm pretty active, or I like following politics and learning about that stuff. And one of the statistics I've read that by 2045, 70% of the population of the United States will be in the top 15 states. So essentially that means that 30 senators will be in charge of 70% of the population of the United States, and 70 senators will have the majority. So the majority of the Senate will be only voiced by 30% of the population. How do you feel about, say, that shift? And when things like that become so dramatic, which have changed since 1789, as you brought up, do you think there needs to be constitutional reforms?
Well, the crazy thing about it is I think most of the founders would say absolutely yes. What's the matter with you people? Fix it. They were mostly very pragmatic men. And the circumstance that is evolving with respect to representation in the Senate is not pragmatic.
Yes, that is very true. Yeah, it's definitely a big change. So now I want to talk about a little bit about, let me see what I have here. I'm sorry, about the card-driven aspect of like a lot of the games you get into. So how did you decide to sort of stay with that format to drive the point of your game? Or which came first, the chicken or the egg? Was it like, wow, we have this idea for a game we want to do, or your style of games? Or did the card driven aspect come later or first?
So the short answer is that the card driven aspect came first. And as you know from the games I've designed, I'm like interested in this nexus between politics and warfare, or politics and conflict. And for a very long time, I came into the hobby as a war gamer. And for a very long time, politics in warfare was ignored, even though, everyone knew Clausewitz's old, war is politics by other means. But to the extent politics was incorporated into a game about the Civil War or a game about World War II or whatever, it tended either to be hardwired into the rules. There would be pages and pages of political rules that were sort of if-then approach to resolving politics. Or worse, it was like a random events chart. You would just roll dice and that would trigger Mussolini or whatever. It was as if politics had no predictive or rational a rational impact on warfare, and that may be reflective of how the Pentagon views the Congress and the rest of it, but it is nevertheless nonsense. So what card-driven games allow you to do, and what makes them so good at simulating politics, is that every card is essentially a rule, a contextualized rule. You can say right there on the card, if these things are true, then this political impact happens. And that's so much better than either having to hardwire everything into the rules and make people memorize it, or just randomizing politics as if there was no rhyme or reason to it. And ever since that innovation, starting with We the People, I think that has become the preferred approach to marrying conflict simulations and political simulations.
Well, designing a game, yes. Now, designing a game like that with history and politics and stuff, it's great that your passion, your labor of love, was able to reach the audience and people. It just became so widely accepted. Were you surprised by that? Because instead of it being like a niche genre and a certain clientele of people, it seemed to, for some reason, just touch a lot of people, and a lot of people were attracted to it. Was that surprising to you?
It definitely came as a surprise. We never dreamed that it would be that successful, and it was the breadth of the audience that we eventually touched was not really where we were aiming initially. We got lucky in a couple of ways. The first way we got lucky is shortly, though I came into the hobby as a wargamer, I was a Eurogamer as well, and I was attending Alan Moon's gathering, which is a big, not a physically big convention, but a convention where a lot of game designers and German game companies come to the U.S. and intermingle. And I was, shortly after the game came out, I was going up to the gathering, and I get to the gathering, and it's a 2-week affair, and I was only coming for 1 week or something. And I get up there, my friends are like, all Alan Moon has done is play your game since this convention started. I'm like, what? They're like, he's in a back room right now playing Twilight Struggle. So I go back there, and he's sort of raving about the design, and then says a bunch of amazing things in public about it. And, that was to have Alan Moon, who's, a Spiel des Jahres Euro game designer, saying, this is a game you should try. It helped get the attention of a lot of Eurogamers who probably would not have tried a GMT product up until then because they thought there was nothing in there for them.
Right. Yeah. Definitely getting an endorsement by Alan would definitely help a lot.
The other thing that I think that worked for us is that at that moment in time, the global war on terror was really, front and center. 9/11 had happened and all of that. And the result was a little bit of kind of a Cold War nostalgia. The Cold War seemed much less, it weirdly seemed less dangerous. It was certainly more straightforward. We knew who our enemies were. It was the Russians. They acted like this. We act like that. They have their competing system, et cetera, et cetera. It was well understood because it had gone on for so long also. And terrorism, first because it had struck so dramatically inside our own country. And secondly, by its very nature, with its kind of covert aspect and infiltration and worries about a fifth column and kind of its religious component, seemed much more unsettling, I think, to people. And so there was this interest in the Cold War. To a certain extent, that interest remains, really. I can't tell you how many people I've encountered who said, I didn't know anything about the Cold War, which is, of course, bizarre all by itself, if you're our age. And I played your game, and then I went and read a whole bunch about it because I got so interested. And that, of course, is super gratifying.
Oh, no, absolutely. It's so, because it really does teach you, and it's, you just learn a lot by playing that game. So one of the things, again, here's a chicken or the egg question. When you had a complete game, did you find GMT? Did GMT find you? Why did you choose? Was it because of We the People and things like of other games in that genre? Why did you choose GMT to publish your game?
So the reason we chose GMT is because we've been playtesting for them, and so we knew the right people there already. And we went up to the World Board Gaming Championships, which they were either in Maryland. They were in Maryland at the time, which was close to both Ananda and I, and showed them our prototype, and they essentially said yes. In that time, GMT went through a very serious financial crisis, and it looked as if they might go under. So I actually began to shop the game around to a couple of other publishers, but at the end of the day, everything pulled out the right way, and they published it, and I'm glad they published it. It fits at the time for sure. It fit best with them as opposed to any other company.
Yes, it does. And in particular, like me, a Eurogamer, I definitely feel that the card-driven aspect is what appeals to me, or what's able to make it, for lack of a better term, palatable for somebody like me who's like a dry Eurogamer. So that kind of allowed me to start learning and more about GMT games because of the card-driven aspect. So was that an intention also, even though not just the card play, but realizing that it would be more accessible to a lot more players?
Well, that was definitely our intention. And I think GMT, I mean, if you were to ask them, I think they would honestly say that they didn't strategically set out to use Twilight Struggle to draw in Eurogamers, but they figured it out, that that's what was happening. And it allowed them to highlight other aspects of their catalog that would also have crossover appeal. So Dominant Species is well regarded in the Eurogame community. A lot of folks who won't play a heavy war game do play Volko's Coin, the counterinsurgency games. Of course, they've been sort of redone by Root, and if you, I guess, throw in a few cats and raccoons and whatnot, it makes it makes a war game accessible. But that Root is essentially the counterinsurgency system applied to cats. So yeah, they and now they're trying to do a number of these kind of projects that still incorporate history, but allow their games to be accessible to people who do not want to play a hex and counter war game.
Right. So one interesting thing I'd like to ask you about, say now and moving forward, is you clearly thought or said that after 9/11 that there was sort of a nostalgia because terrorism and all that kind of stuff. However, you did design Imperial Struggle, and that was sort of a direct skin from that. But by designing that, then inherently you're going to know there sort of isn't going to be that nostalgia, and there's not going to be anybody who sort of lived through that period. So did you realize that it's almost inherently going to be received differently than Twilight Struggle?
Well, that's an extraordinarily good question. The short answer is that we were working on this project for so long that no, we didn't really understand the societal and historical moment that we would be introducing it into. And for very, very good reasons, colonialism is an extraordinarily sensitive subject at the moment that is finally getting the kind of close scrutiny and revision that it has always deserved. Now, Ananda and I are not the type of people who would who would design a game that's like, hooray colonialism. That isn't what we were about. It's not the kind of game I would want to design, you know, guys with pith helmets oppressing native peoples or whatever. But it does touch on this sensitive subject at a time when there's heightened scrutiny on anything like it. That said, I'm proud of the historicity in the game. It's not like we tried to ignore the realities of colonialism, but much like Twilight Struggle, we try to put the players in the roles of the protagonists. And you know, the roles of the British government and the French monarch, they're a little, well, not a little, they're a lot cynical when it comes to the impacts of empire building on native peoples.
Okay, and not having played Imperial Struggle yet, and we haven't, so I'm going to be getting there soon. Am I going to learn like I did with Twilight Struggle? Do you know what I mean? Like, is it going to give me an education as I'm playing the game, or is the game play sort of just by itself, and you're not going to really learn? I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
I understand what you're saying. I think you will inevitably learn in Imperial Struggle because a lot of the context of these wars is less familiar than the Cold War or World War II or the Civil War. I mean, there just are not a lot of games that cover the War of Austrian Succession and Spanish Succession, full stop. So all by itself, you learn something there. But the real point of this game, the object that Ananda and I had in mind from the beginning of the design process, is that we wanted to illustrate in kind of a war game context the interrelationship between war and peace. There are almost no games deal with how wars end. You reach a number of turns, you touch this victory hex, whatever, but then no one explains, okay, well, what happens in the peace process, and how do these, why is there this kind of cynical trading of colonies that is so endemic in the 17th and 18th centuries, and why does any of it matter? And those are the questions that we try to answer in this game. It's, that victory point hex, the big star on that space on a board game. We're not going to have to tell you it's important because we're going to put a star on it. We're going to illustrate why it's important, because you'll see why control of this fisheries market matters for the long-term success of your empire.
Okay, and then also about that with the history too, you're doing Twilight Struggle. Is it Red Sea? Is that correct? Okay, so again, you're reaching I guess a part of history that I'm unfamiliar with as well. So why did you choose that?
So, there are little nagging. You design a game and there are little like nagging things that stick in the back of your head that you didn't cover. Well, one of the things that I always knew that we did not cover in, though I was alive and remember to a certain extent it happening, not that we got a ton of US coverage on it, but I just had an awareness that this was going on. But there was a conflict in the Horn of Africa between Ethiopia and Somalia. It's called the Ogaden War, or the Ogden War. And it is one of the most cynical, fascinating conflicts in all of the Cold War, because the United States had been a firm ally of Ethiopia throughout the Cold War under its monarchy. And in the 70s, there was initially just an officer coup and then kind of a Marxist. That officer coup took on a Marxist nature, and Ethiopia switched sides and became a Soviet satellite state. And Somalia, which had a large Soviet naval base, but could not abide the Ethiopians, approached the Carter administration and was like, hey, how about we become allies? And that's what happened. And so then our former client state, Ethiopia, and the former Soviet client state, Somalia, fight a war, with the Somalis initially making enormous gains and the Russians having to intervene directly in order to keep Somalia from winning. And things are so confused. Our allies have not adjusted. Romania is supporting Somalia still, which is now a US-backed client state, and the Israelis have special forces in Ethiopia supporting the Ethiopian government. That's how nutty this conflict was. So I really wanted to do two things. One is to provide an introductory game experience for Twilight Struggle. So this is like a 2-turn Twilight Struggle experience. You can play the whole damn thing in 35 minutes. Oh, wow. And then if you play it, you can use that as a teaching mechanism to introduce the longer game to someone else. And I get to cover this obscure, interesting piece of Cold War history that I'd never gotten around to before.
Okay, so that brings me to an interesting question. So do you have the privilege now, say, of being able to design a game with this obscure sort of topic and theme because you have the privilege of an audience who's going to know immediately Twilight Struggle? Oh, so I love Twilight Struggle. I know Twilight Struggle, so I'm going there. Is that intentional?
Yeah, that's absolutely intentional. I mean, who the hell couldn't market a game on the Ogaden War otherwise? But if you say, well, it's part of the Twilight Struggle system, you start out with a potential audience of a couple 100,000 people or something.
No. Yes, of course. But what I mean is, it's again, it's just, to me, it seems like that is such an obscure thing.
Oh, yeah. Not just to you, it's obscure.
It is obscure. Okay, but it's obviously deeply intriguing to you. But I'm just like, he could have picked. There are probably a couple of dozen other things he could have picked. So I'm just wondering why sort of maybe some of those other things got overlooked and you decided to choose this one particular thing.
Well, the reason I chose this one particular thing is that I had ignored it in Twilight Struggle. There is no card that represents the conflict in the Horn of Africa, and that's a mistake because it was an important part of the end of the Cold War. It was a flashpoint, I should say. And since it's not represented in Twilight Struggle, I'd always been like, I need to, someday when we do another round, I need to do at least an Ogden War card or a Horn of Africa scoring or something that represents this. And then when I had this discussion with Gene, they're, for good reason, they're eager to have more Twilight Struggle material. And I was like, well, let me just put a small game together and see if I can hit a number of objectives at once. And so that was the impetus. But you're absolutely right. Could I have done Southeast Asia? Could I have done the conflict in Central America in more detail? Any of those other things are also potentialities. But I like introducing new history to players. I think it's interesting to me. And since I have to design the damn thing, I think that's important.
Yes, of course. Now, here's a question that I have in particular. I hope other people do too. That's the purpose of these interviews. Hopefully you can answer and we can find out more information about you and stuff. But when it comes to being a game designer, did you ever, because of the tremendous success of Twilight Struggle, did you ever have the option, say, of becoming a full-time game designer? Was that ever in your plan, in your dreams, or like, you know what I mean? Was that ever a point or a discussion in your life? Or did you have I mean,
I think it is it. Well, I say this. I right the second it's about to get further away. It was something that I had been thinking about lately, and was like, I'm starting. It's not just because of Twilight Struggle, but I have all of these titles out there, and I get royalty checks, and it's starting to look feasible that I could do something like that. But in the meantime, I'm still living in one of the most expensive cities in the country, and I'm paying private school college tuition for my daughter. So I think lobbying is a more sure thing for the time being.
Well, yeah, but I mean, good, and thank you for that honest answer. But again, so it is something that you'd like to do, right? I mean,
yeah, sure. I mean, well, no, that's not. You know what? When I first came out with a game, my attitude was, if I had to do this all the time, I might learn to hate it, and it could become a job. And now I'm kind of mellowing on that. I really enjoy the reading and all of that so much. I don't feel the same about that. The thing I still hate the most is the actual physical production of prototypes. That's the thing that drives me back.
I can imagine. So if you did say have that opportunity, right? So come tomorrow, you were able to financially support your family as well as you are now as a lobbyist being a game designer. Would you proceed with different levels? Because as you just mentioned, the Twilight Struggle, the Red Sea would be a 2-turn, 35-minute game as opposed to a longer game like Twilight Struggle, or would you optimally stay on one path? Like, what would be your preferred choice of what type of games you would pursue?
So one of my approaches to game design right from the get-go is to always define the basic parameters of the design. And like, okay, how many players, how long do we want it to take, how complex, and kind of board size, and all of these physical dimensions. How many cards, if we're going to have cards in the game, how many are we including? And I use those parameters to help guide how long and detailed the game is going to be. I do think also that to a certain extent, designs, their depth and time should reflect a little bit the subject matter. So if Twilight Struggle is a 3-hour game and it covers 50 years of history, how can I justify a 4-hour game on 3 months of history? Or, I do think that scale and scope should mesh a little more. I remember playing Passive Glory and then playing a successor game. Passive Glory is a World War I game that covers the entirety of World War I, and it takes probably 8 hours to play. And this is when I was still young enough and didn't have kids, and 8 hours for a single game was okay. And then I played a successor game that was just on the Middle East in World War I, which is kind of a backwater theater of World War I. And it was it was like 12 or 13 hours to play. And I'm like, how did this happen?
Yeah, because that doesn't sound like a lot of fun. So another question. Now, this is just more for me because again, I'm really into politics, and I would love to talk to you about that. But again, I don't know if the audience would like to hear a lot about that.
Fair enough.
There's one question I would like to ask, and it's for me. So, when you said the founding fathers were like real pragmatic, and why wouldn't they look at things and adjust things and all that kind of stuff? And then, like when Amy Coney Barrett was introduced as a new Supreme Court justice, I first heard of the term originalist. And so I started looking into it and all that kind of stuff. And from what I understand, again, I have not played your game, The Founding Fathers, but from the little research I did, and I could be wrong, um, participants play cards and they decide, and it's sort of like they're sort of, I guess, making the laws or rules as they're playing. So would somebody like me who has an interest in learning about this, would I get an understanding of because I don't want to read a book. I don't want to, like learn. I want to play a game and learn. Would I be able to, from playing the Founding Fathers, to perhaps learn a little bit more about that part in history?
You certainly would. I think what that game, what we spent a lot of time on, and what works extraordinarily well. So first of all, the Founding Fathers did something extraordinarily convenient. Only 55 of them showed up to the Constitutional Convention. The standard print run for a card sheet is 110. So you can get 2 sets of delegates out of 1 print run for a board game. So that was really nice of them to organize themselves.
Yeah.
But the thing that we did in that game is each delegate is an event, and we tried very much to marry the event that each delegate that's on each delegate card with their either personality or their contribution to the Constitutional Convention. And all of those cards have some flavor text. There's also a lot more information, in the supplement. But if you play that game a couple of times, you will definitely have an impression of all of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention. They come with very different. They come with very different perspectives. Some of the delegates were very anti-democratic, and they became anti-democratic because they had this experience of very direct democracy in the states in between the time of independence, but before we had passed the Constitutional Convention. Virginia, for instance, had annual elections, and it was kind of a madhouse.
Wow. Okay. Well, then I'm going to go ahead and have to play that game to learn more. Because especially this past year and this past election cycle and all that kind of stuff has really invigorated, I should say, a lot of intrigue in me about the whole process and everything. So, Jason, first of all, I want to thank you very much for joining me today. But before we go, if you could, I'd like you to go ahead and take a minute or two, or however long it takes, to let the audience know what you have upcoming, what you have in the works, and what we can look forward to coming from Jason Mathews.
Awesome. So right now, as you alluded to, I have in playtesting Twilight Struggle Red Sea, which, as I said, is kind of a introductory scenario for Twilight Struggle. It will be part of GMT's lunchtime series, and it really will be a game that is playable in that kind of time frame that you could play over lunch at work. It will also be a great way, if you wanted to learn Twilight Struggle, a great introduction to the game without putting in the full time commitment, but you'll get a flavor of it, and then we'll be able to move on to the full game without any difficulty. The second thing that I'm working on right now is a game called United States versus Aaron Burr, and it is also a card-driven game, but the focus is on a courtroom trial. I think thanks to Hamilton, everybody knows who Aaron Burr was, or maybe it was that milk commercial. But anyway, Aaron Burr infamously shot Alexander Hamilton, who was a friend and colleague at one point. And but he never stood trial for that. Nothing ever became of that. But his story gets more and more bizarre after that, because shortly after he was thrown off the ticket as vice president for Jefferson, he went on a misadventure trying to carve out the western states of the Louisiana Purchase and create an independent kingdom. And he had a pretty elaborate plan and lots of backers, and members of the Senate who are involved in the intrigue, and the story goes on and on. But eventually, Jefferson felt compelled to act, had him arrested and brought to trial for treason in Virginia. And so this game is about that treason trial.
Oh, okay, very interesting. And I'm sorry, you just sort of brought up one more question. I'm sorry, just going a little bit long, and I really wanted to ask you. So you did say that you do default to fun over, I guess, accuracy, if I'm correct there. However, and again, I'm just wondering because you sort of brought this up with the new game you're working on with US versus Aaron Burr. But do you think it's possible, feasible, practicable for you to learn correctly education through gaming? Have you been approached? Would it be even possible to say teach an entire subject, or to really, instead of reading a book, maybe more accessible to kids, to student college students or whatever, but playing games would be better for education? And I'd like to close with that, with your thoughts on that as far as learning through gaming.
Great. And actually, don't let me forget, there's one other thing I have to plug before I get off. I am extraordinarily interested in this subject. I have done a lot of reading about it, and prior to the COVID crisis, I had been involved with a group run by Asmodee. Asmodee is making a very large investment in this subject in France and is looking to do something similar here in the United States. And they had, I don't know exactly how they found me or decided that my games were of interest to the subject, but anyway, they reached out to me, and I helped them find a few other education experts and whatnot in the United States that might be part of that. Of course, everything's put on hold with what a nutty year this is, but I'm sure that will resume once civilization returns. I was lucky enough to be invited to something like the National Convention in Denmark. And as part of my experience there, Denmark has this strange system which has this crazy, weird history related to the Danish-Prussian War in the 19th century. And but in any event, in like your 12th grade year, your 11th and 12th grade year in Denmark, it's very typical for a kid to be sent away to some kind of boarding school. And at those boarding schools, they tend to have a specialization. So you might go to a computer boarding school where you build your own computer, or an acting boarding school, whatever, some kind of organizing theme. And as part of my trip, my children and I spent a week at one of these after schools, as they're called. And the after school taught all of its lessons through live action role play. So they had built a medieval city outside the school grounds. They had these elaborate sets of costumes. And, if they were, and they would do like a month-long historical or fantasy theme. So if they were doing Romans, they would study the metallurgy of Roman armor in their science class, and how catapults work in mathematics, and Latin and Cicero, and all of these sort of things. And that was their whole approach. Of course, it's an incredibly interesting experiment. Whatever they couldn't do from LARPing, they tried to gamify or use board games to fill in those gaps. They, unfortunately, because Denmark does not believe in high stakes testing like we do in the United States or in the Asian educational models, there's not a lot of great comparative statistics on does this really work or can it really help. But I will say there was incredible enthusiasm from the students at the school. Like they could not barely wait to tell me how much they love their school.
I can imagine. That sounds absolutely fantastic. Okay, so you did say you had one more project you'd like to plug.
Yes. So I am a member of the board of something called the Zenobia Awards, which is a new, exciting project from, it was initiated by Volko Runke and Harold Buchanan, who are two of my colleagues who work closely with GMT mostly. And the object of this is a design competition and mentorship, which will have cash prizes, trying to encourage people of color and members of the LGBT community to join the historical game design community. Right now, historical game design is mostly old white guys that look like me, and we're interested in expanding the hobby and expanding the diversity of the community. And we think this is an important first step. So if there are any aspiring designers that fit that profile, I would highly encourage them to take a look at the Zenobia Awards and think about submitting a design this year. And if they can't put something together this year, it'll be running again next year.
Well, that's fantastic, Jason. It's great that you're doing that to open the door for more designers to create historical games and to get into the game. So thank you very much for doing that. But thank you so much for spending the time today. I'm so sorry I went a little bit long. Hope I didn't take too much time out of your day, but it's fascinating what you do. Thank you so much for your games, for the history, because again, that's why that last question, I feel strongly about that too. I do feel it's much easier for kids to learn through play per se. And I think they're able to retain it more, especially that program you were talking about in Denmark where they're role playing and LARPing. That just sounds incredible. But best of luck in the future for your Red Sea game coming up, and also the US versus Aaron Burr. Really looking forward to those. And thank you for joining us. I'll be back to you in just 1 second.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim.
Well, there you go, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meepleville Meets. As you see, Jason has some quite interesting stuff coming up in the future, and it's great to know that he actually works in Washington in government, like right now. I mean, that's what he's done for a living. So he does have an inside track into the workings of government, and it shows through his game. So it's great to know that not only is he a game maker, but he really does know the stuff that goes behind his games. Well, thanks again for joining us for another episode of Meepleville Meets, and we'll see you soon.